Cop lies to get black teen convicted, confident that no one will question him. Officer Darren Cole sits tall in the witness stand, his polished badge catching the light as he calmly delivers his testimony. His words are smooth, rehearsed, a story he has told before. He describes how he personally saw 17-year-old Jordan Miller fleeing the scene of a robbery, how the evidence all points to him, how justice must be served. Across the room, Jordan sits still, his fists clenched under the table. He knows he's innocent, but does anyone else? The prosecutor nods along, certain of an easy conviction. The judge listens, the jury watches. The courtroom is hanging on to every word the officer says. But what they don't know, what no one is prepared for, is that Jordan's defense is about to change everything. And when the truth comes out, the entire courtroom will be left in shock. Where are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe for more shocking courtroom stories. Jordan Miller sat at the defense table, his hands clenched together under the polished wood, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom on him. The moment the officer finished his testimony, a hushed murmur rippled through the spectators. They had heard his kind before, confident, untouchable, certain that his words would be taken as absolute truth. The courtroom was packed. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes flicking between the officer and Jordan, already forming their own conclusions. Some looked at the young black teen and saw guilt before even hearing his defense. Others, especially those in the back, had seen cases like this too many times to believe in easy justice. At the prosecution's table, Mark Davidson, the state prosecutor, sat with his arms folded, his expression calm but self-assured. To him, this was a case already won. The surveillance footage was grainy, but Officer Cole's statement filled in the gaps. The jury had no reason to doubt the word of a decorated officer against a teenage boy from the wrong neighborhood. Jordan's mother, Angela Miller, sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of her chair. She hadn't spoken once, but her silence spoke volumes. The lines of exhaustion and worry etched into her face told the story of a mother who had spent days praying for a miracle, knowing how these cases usually ended. And then there was Lisa Harrington, Jordan's defense attorney. Dressed sharply in a navy blue blazer, she sat motionless, listening carefully to every word of Officer Cole's testimony. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply watched. Unlike the prosecution, she knew this case wasn't as simple as it seemed, because she had evidence no one else in the courtroom had seen yet. She had stayed silent throughout the officer's statement, letting him dig himself deeper into his lie, waiting for the moment to strike. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, finally turned to Lisa. "Defense, do you have any questions for Officer Cole?" Lisa stood up slowly, adjusting her blazer. The room shifted as all eyes moved to her. She took a step forward, stopping just in front of the witness stand. She tilted her head slightly, studying Officer Cole the way a predator studies its prey. "Just a few, Your Honor," she said smoothly. She turned to the officer, offering a polite smile. But there was something in her eyes that made him shift slightly in his seat. "Officer Cole," she began, her voice steady and measured, "you just testified under oath that you saw my client fleeing the scene of the crime with your own eyes. Is that correct?" Cole nodded. "Yes, that's correct." Lisa let the words settle in the air for a moment before nodding. "And you are absolutely sure it was him?" "Yes," Cole said firmly, crossing his arms. "No doubt about it." A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his face for just a second. Lisa took another step forward, her smile unwavering. "Good," she said, "because I'd like to introduce something to the court that might test the strength of your memory." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. The moment she held it up, a new energy crackled in the air. The spectators murmured louder. The judge raised an eyebrow, and even the prosecutor stiffened. "Your Honor," Lisa said, her voice cool and deliberate, "I have a new piece of surveillance footage that I'd like to submit as evidence, and I believe it will completely change the direction of this case." She turned back to Officer Cole, watching as the smirk he had been wearing all morning slowly began to disappear. A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom as Lisa Harrington held up the small USB drive, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing at the device before turning to the prosecutor. "Does the prosecution have any objections to reviewing this evidence?" Mark Davidson, the state prosecutor, hesitated. He hadn't been expecting this. Up until now, the case had seemed airtight. Officer Cole's testimony had been direct, confident, and free of any doubt. But now, Lisa was introducing something new, something that hadn't been considered before. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, we'd like to review the footage before presenting it to the jury." Lisa smiled slightly. She had anticipated this hesitation. "Of course," she said smoothly, "but I assure you, this will be worth everyone's time." The judge gave a brief nod before motioning toward the courtroom clerk, who took the USB and inserted it into the computer. The room fell silent as the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The grainy, unclear footage that the prosecution had relied on earlier was replaced with a new, clearer video from a different angle. Lisa turned toward Officer Cole, watching him closely. "Officer, you testified that you personally saw my client, Jordan Miller, running from the scene of the crime," she said, keeping her voice steady, "and that you were certain it was him?" Cole straightened in his seat. "That's right," he said, though his voice lacked the same confidence it had earlier. Lisa gestured toward the screen as the footage played. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. The video clearly showed a figure running, but it wasn't Jordan. The suspect was taller, bulkier, and dressed completely differently. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jordan's mother let out an audible breath, her hands clutching the armrests of her chair. The prosecutor sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. Officer Cole's face paled. Lisa turned back to the officer, her eyes sharp. "Would you like to explain this, Officer Cole?" she asked. Cole shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat. I must have been mistaken," he muttered, but the damage was already done. Lisa arched an eyebrow. "Mistaken?" she echoed. "You were so sure before. You testified under oath with absolute certainty that you saw Jordan Miller. And yet," she gestured to the screen again, "this footage shows without a doubt that the person who actually committed the crime was someone else entirely." Cole opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, everyone processing what they had just seen. Lisa took another step forward. "Tell me, Officer Cole, was this really a mistake?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made everyone lean in. "Or were you trying to put an innocent black teenager behind bars?" A stunned silence filled the room. The weight of her question hung in the air, pressing down on the already crumbling officer. The judge exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "Officer Cole, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The courtroom remained frozen in silence as Lisa Harrington's piercing question hung in the air. Every eye was locked on Officer Darren Cole, whose once confident posture had visibly crumbled. Beads of sweat formed on his brow as he shifted in his seat, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. The truth had been exposed, and there was no escaping it now. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, his expression stern. "Officer Cole, you are under oath. I strongly advise you to answer the question." His voice carried an authority that left no room for argument. Lisa stepped closer to the witness stand, her movements slow and deliberate. "Let me remind you," she said, her tone steady, "that the footage we just saw clearly shows that Jordan Miller was not the person you claimed to have seen. And yet, you testified under oath, without hesitation, that you saw him running from the scene of the crime. So, Officer Cole, was it truly a mistake, or were you deliberately trying to frame my client?" A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jordan sat rigid in his chair, his fists clenched beneath the table, barely breathing as he waited for Cole's response. His mother, seated in the front row, clutched her hands together tightly, silently praying for justice. Cole swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as he grappled for an explanation. I must have misidentified him," he finally stammered, his voice lacking the same arrogance it had earlier. "It was a chaotic scene. I thought I saw him." Lisa's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Interesting," she mused, turning toward the jury. "Because just 20 minutes ago, this officer sat in that chair and swore, under oath, that he had no doubt Jordan Miller was the suspect. But now, with clear video evidence proving otherwise, suddenly he thought he saw him." Cole's face turned red as whispers spread through the courtroom. The jury members exchanged glances, their skepticism growing. Lisa wasn't done. She turned back to the screen. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce one more piece of evidence," she said, gesturing to the courtroom clerk. Another video file appeared on the screen, and the room held its collective breath. The footage played. This time, it was a body cam recording. Officer Cole's body cam. Lisa's voice rang out. "This is footage taken from Officer Cole's patrol car on the night of the arrest. Pay close attention." The recording showed Cole approaching Jordan on the street, just minutes after the crime had taken place. His voice crackled through the speakers. "That's him. He fits the description. Cuff him." The clip ended. Lisa let the silence stretch. "Fits the description," Lisa repeated, her voice cutting through the air. "Tell me, Officer Cole, what exactly about my client fit the description? Was it his height? His clothing? His face?" Cole remained silent. Lisa took a step closer. "Or was it simply the fact that he was a young black teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Gasps erupted from the spectators. The prosecutor, who had remained still for most of the trial, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the judge looked unsettled. Lisa's voice grew sharper. "You didn't see Jordan Miller commit any crime, did you, Officer Cole?" Cole's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. I was just doing my job," he muttered. Lisa scoffed. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not target innocent black teenagers to close cases faster." The courtroom broke into whispers. Jordan's mother covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Judge Reynolds straightened, his gaze locked onto the officer. "Officer Cole," he said, his voice low but firm, "this court takes perjury very seriously. Are you admitting that your testimony was false?" Cole hesitated, but it was too late. The evidence had spoken louder than he ever could. He glanced toward the prosecutor for help, but even Davidson refused to meet his gaze. He was alone now. "I made an error in judgment," Cole muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa stepped back, nodding as if she had expected nothing less. She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have now seen the truth. The prosecution built its entire case on one officer's word, and today that word has been exposed as a lie." She let the weight of her words settle over the room. "This case is no longer about a robbery," she continued. "It's about justice, about how easily a young black teen's life could have been stolen because of one officer's lie." A deep silence spread through the courtroom. The judge exhaled slowly, looking toward the jury. "I believe we've seen enough. The court will reconvene after the jury reaches a verdict." With a final knock of the gavel, he dismissed the jury. Jordan let out a shaky breath, his shoulders trembling as he realized what had just happened. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he had hope. The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension and uncertainty. Jordan Miller sat still at the defense table, his fingers curled against his knees. For the first time, there was hope. But even hope felt fragile when you had spent your entire life knowing the system wasn't built to protect you. Across the room, Officer Darren Cole sat stiffly in the witness chair, his hands gripping the edges. His once confident smirk was long gone. His body language screamed discomfort, as if the weight of his own actions had finally caught up to him. Lisa Harrington exhaled slowly, gathering her notes, though she knew the real work had already been done. The truth was out. The officer had lied. The evidence had proven Jordan's innocence. But would it be enough? She glanced toward the prosecution's table where Mark Davidson sat with a clenched jaw, his hands folded in frustration. The entire case had unraveled before his eyes, and he knew it. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Officer Cole, I need you to understand the gravity of what has just taken place here today," he said, his expression unreadable. "You did not just make a mistake. You stood in this courtroom, under oath, and fabricated a statement that could have ruined an innocent boy's life." He let his words sink in, allowing the weight of the moment to press down on the disgraced officer. Cole said nothing. He had no defense left. Jordan swallowed, his throat dry. For days, he had felt powerless, from the moment of his arrest to the cold, suffocating hours spent in a holding cell, to now, his fate hanging in the balance. But as he sat there, looking around at the people in the courtroom, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every other kid who had been in his position, who had been told their word meant nothing in the face of a badge. Lisa turned to face the jury box as the judge continued. "This court will not tolerate the abuse of power," Judge Reynolds stated, "and we will not allow false testimonies to dictate the lives of the innocent." His words rang through the courtroom, a promise of justice, in a system where it was rarely given. The doors opened, and the jury filed back in. The weight in Jordan's chest tightened. This was it. His mother gripped the edge of her chair, barely breathing. The judge turned to the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? A short pause. Then the foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Jordan's pulse pounded in his ears. Everything that had happened, all the lies, all the fear, led to this moment. Lisa folded her hands in front of her, standing tall beside him. She had done her job. Now it was up to them. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to hear the words that would decide Jordan Miller's future. The entire courtroom held its breath as the jury foreman stood, a small piece of paper in his hands. Jordan Miller's fate rested on just a few words. His pulse pounded in his ears, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the defense table. This was it. His mother sat frozen in the front row, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, her hands clasped tightly together as if she were holding on to hope with everything she had left. Judge Reynolds nodded toward the foreman. "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat, unfolding the paper slowly. The silence in the room was unbearable, thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, he spoke. "In the case of the State versus Jordan Miller on the charge of robbery, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The room exploded with gasps and whispers. Jordan's body slumped in his chair, all the air rushing out of his lungs at once. He blinked, almost unable to process the words. Not guilty. After days of fear, after sleepless nights in a holding cell, after standing in a courtroom where the odds were stacked against him, he was free. His mother let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hands before pulling him into a crushing hug. Tears streamed down her face, her relief visible in every trembling breath. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you're free." Jordan clung to her, feeling the weight that had been suffocating him finally lift. Lisa Harrington exhaled deeply, her face betraying no emotion other than quiet satisfaction. Justice had won today, but it had been a fight. One that shouldn't have had to happen in the first place. She turned slightly, her sharp eyes landing on Officer Darren Cole, who now sat pale and stiff in the witness chair. He had tried to send an innocent kid to prison. He had lied, abused his badge, and now the tables had turned. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel once, calling for order as the murmurs in the courtroom continued. His gaze settled on Officer Cole, his expression firm and unreadable. "As for Officer Darren Cole," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "this court takes the issue of perjury and false testimony very seriously. You knowingly lied under oath, fabricating evidence that could have cost an innocent young man his future." He let the words sink in before continuing. "This court is recommending a full investigation into your conduct, and I am forwarding this case to Internal Affairs. You are hereby ordered to remain in custody for further questioning." A stunned silence followed. Then the sound of approaching footsteps. 2 uniformed officers moved toward the witness stand. For the first time, Darren Cole looked small. His authority, his arrogance, gone. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but he had nothing left to say. The evidence had spoken for him. Jordan watched as Cole was placed in handcuffs, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on him. For once, the system had worked in his favor. But as he sat there, a cold realization settled in his chest. How many others weren't as lucky? How many kids like him had been locked away because they didn't have a lawyer like Lisa or a judge willing to listen, or a piece of footage that could prove their innocence? Lisa turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "It's over, Jordan. You won." He nodded slowly, still trying to believe it. But this wasn't just about him anymore. As he stood up, the weight in his chest shifted. He had survived. He had fought back. And now he had something even greater, the power to make sure no one else had to go through what he did. He took one last look at the courtroom, then walked out, not just as a free man, but as someone ready to change the world. As Jordan Miller stepped out of the courtroom, the cool air hit his face, yet the weight of the last few days still lingered in his chest. He was free, but he knew that not everyone got the same chance. The justice system had tried to crush him, but today the truth had won. He glanced back one last time, seeing the image that would stay with him forever. Officer Darren Cole, handcuffed, led away by the very system he once abused. His mother walked beside him, wiping tears from her face, her relief mixed with exhaustion. "It's over, baby," she whispered. But Jordan knew better. For him, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He had seen firsthand how easily one lie could destroy a life. He had felt the fear, the helplessness, and the crushing weight of knowing the truth didn't always matter. And he wasn't going to forget it. Lisa Harrington caught up to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did more than win today, Jordan," she said. "You showed them you weren't just another statistic. You fought back." He nodded, a fire burning inside him. This wasn't just his victory, it was a message. And one day, he would make sure no other innocent kid had to sit in that defendant's chair, hoping for a miracle. Do you think Officer Cole got what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in justice, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful courtroom stories.